Welcome to the shop. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the Dynasty Diagnostic podcast, a part of the Dynasty Trade Calculator family of podcasts and brought to you by my bookie. My name is Eitan Mosier. I'm here with Sam Stompy Lane as I am every single week. How's the Scott Fishbowl treating you, Sam?
It started off a little bit rough in week one. I had Aaron Rodgers and Mitchell Trubisky in week one. That was rough, but won the last two. Picked up some guys along the way. I believe DJ Chark was in there. I got Gardner Minshew as well. Starting to pick up a little bit.
Yeah, to tell you the truth, I had no faith in DJ Chark. I had no faith in DJ Chark at all, but you seem to have him in every single league that I'm in with you. And it turns out that, this isn't like a 1 week wonder like we originally thought it might be with a guy like Chark. We thought Westbrook would be the guy in that offense. And while Westbrook, I don't think is necessarily in a position that you should be worried about him, because I do think that he's the PPR 10 points a game guy that you thought that you were getting anyway. But, Chark is getting volume on top of touchdowns. It's not just the scores that are doing it for me. So he seems to be a guy that might be here to stay for a little while.
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't think you're going to expect them to throw a ton, though, with John DeFilippo. His offenses do tend to throw a decent amount, but Chark seems to have taken over as the wide receiver one there. Unfortunately for our DD love, but I would say all three, they're running more of an 11 personnel, and we'll see what happens when Josh Oliver comes back, but they're not really using their tight ends all that much. I think you can trust most of these guys. You can trust Chris Conley. Chris Conley's getting 70+% of the snaps. Dede, he would have had a big game had he not had two drops on Thursday night. And then DJ Chark, like you said, he's gotten the volume. He hasn't got a ton of volume, but he's getting 4+ targets a game. And when you're expecting 15+ yards per reception, you're going to have, and I don't think you can really expect him to do what he has done thus far throughout the season. I'm sure there's going to be some bust games, but there's also going to be some boom games, and that's what you would expect from a wide receiver like DJ Chark, who's a speed guy and can take the top off of a defense.
Now, while we're going to be here and we're going to talk about DJ Chark and we're going to talk about Dede Westbrook, we're not going to get away from talking about the Jacksonville Jaguars without talking about my guy Leonard Fournette. And he is doing exactly what I thought he would do this year. And he hasn't even scored a touchdown, I don't believe yet. But he's been a consistent presence just because of the amount of volume that he's seeing in that backfield. Now he's more involved as a receiver in that offense. You mentioned them not necessarily having a third, hoping Conley can get that point, but they don't necessarily have a number 3 receiver outside of Leonard Fournette on that team. He's actually on pace for something in the range of 70 catches, and that is something that just kind of cements his value again for as long as he stays healthy. On the other side of that coin, of course, is always Dalvin Cook, who's having himself a monstrous year, and that is, happy. That's a good thing for those who have him on their teams, but that's also a really, really concerning thing for all Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs owners. It's been a rough one for Diggs in particular because he hasn't been the one to pull in those touchdowns for the first few weeks of the season. Do we think that this type of play is here to stay? See, for me, if the Minnesota Vikings were losing consistently, then I would think that the coach would eventually make a change, but they're not. They're still pulling out games. They're still grinding out games. If this is a viable strategy, I don't think that there's any reason that Zimmer goes and changes it. And if that's the case, then Dalvin Cook could be the RB1 this season.
Yeah, I think you hit on the biggest concern there is that they are 2-1. They've dominated 2 games, and I mean, the other game that they lost was Green Bay. But yeah, I mean, against Atlanta, they dominated on defense and ran the ball well. Against Oakland, they did the same thing, and that's the issue here. Is if it wasn't working, he would change it, but it's obviously working. I mean, I personally have to believe that they're going to have to throw more because right now they're throwing the ball 39% of the time. And the last
it's some of the lowest in the last like 20 years.
Right. Well, just looking at Sharp Football stats, when we look at the last 3 seasons, not including 2019, the lowest is the Seattle Seahawks 48% of the time. So they had a 48-52 pass to run ratio. That's the lowest.
Just a 9% difference. That's nothing. Yeah, nothing that we should really be worried about here.
So unless they're going like real old school, I just can't imagine that they can maintain this, and they're going to have to throw the ball more. I would say that, and that's what we'll talk about today in our 5-point inspection is buys and sells. Stephon Diggs being one of them, but I have to think that the wide receivers and Kirk Cousins are going to positively regress at some point this season.
And for me, even if that day doesn't necessarily come, I don't think that that's the death knell for Stephon Diggs. I think in the same way as kind of last season when one of them had their moment to shine as the season went on, that eventually shifted from Adam Thielen to Stephon Diggs. I think it can be the same thing in favor of Diggs towards the end of the season, just because eventually defenses are going to start keying in on the guy that is scoring, week after week. So I really do think that this is going to be one of those situations where you're worried about the overall volume. You don't necessarily know which one of those receivers is going to pop off, but I don't think it's just going to be Thielen consistently. I would worry about kind of what we were talking about in the offseason about a late season regression from a guy like Adam Thielen that kind of completely turned his fantasy season around last year. So this is a thing that sound thing to do. If a coach is winning with his strategy, that is just a thing that
Eitan, you just froze for about half a minute there.
Awesome. I don't even know where I stopped.
I don't either.
Perfect. Okay, hold on.
Something about Adam Thielen.
Okay, so I think this can be the same type of situation like we had last year with Adam Thielen, where it was one or the other in that offense. I don't necessarily think it's going to be him the entire time this season. I do think Diggs will get his, but I think it'll be at the expense of Thielen in those games. I really think it's just going to be one of those guys at a time that is giving you the points to really make you feel comfortable starting either one of them. So I would just hope, like you hope, that eventually we start to see a little positive regression when it comes to just the sheer number of passing attempts on that offense. But for as long as it's working, it's working.
Yeah, I agree. The tough thing about the Vikings is like you can't stack the box against them, because once you do that, you have 2 of the best wide receivers in the game on the outside there or in the slot, and they're going to beat you one-on-one most of the time. So it's a conundrum. I do think in order for them to continue to win and to compete for the AFC North, they will have to throw, but it's definitely going to be less than what we expected, like probably more of a 50-50 split from here on
out. Even just look at the teams in that division now. Chicago Bears is a defensive team. Mitch Trubisky's had 3 touchdowns. Yes, I understand, but I mean, 2 of those were from about a foot away from the end zone. Like, this is a guy that isn't necessarily.
Hold on, did you just pivot to talking about Mitch Trubisky because of your hate? You literally just pivoted from the. Oh, now look at this division. Mitch Trubisky, that guy's. But
here's why I did it. Here's why I did it. It's because when you look at his performances, when you look at Aaron Rodgers' performances as well, you start to see a division that's more defensive. It isn't necessarily going to be running up the score. This isn't a wide open division where you're going to see high scoring games. So this might be a strategy for the Minnesota Vikings that could work in this type of division. That's where I was going with this.
Right. I mean, and you know, it's funny. We expected kind of the inverse. Well, maybe not the inverse, but Detroit's throwing the ball a lot more than we expected. And meanwhile, the Vikings aren't throwing the ball at all. Like, it's a weird division right now. And I mean, you have 4 competitors right now. I mean, it's got to be the toughest division in the league because Detroit's 2-0-1. The Vikings are 2-1. The Packers are 3-0. The Bears are 2-1, I believe. Mm-hmm. No, yes, because they lost to the Packers. That's right. So it's a tough division, and it's turning into kind of what the AFC North has gotten, and the AFC North is starting to transition a little bit to throwing the ball more. It's kind of weird.
Yeah, it's a reversal of fortune. It's a pendulum that just swings back and forth as we go on in the histories of this game that we love. Saquon Barkley, 101 Barkley, out 4-8. This is a Giants team that was already kind of devoid of weapons on the outside. They do have Tate coming back pretty soon to add whatever he can add to that offense. Evan Ingram's been playing well because he's been getting volume. Daniel Jones is definitely something different for that team. If for nothing else, at least gives that team the athleticism to be able to make up for whatever problems that the offensive line is having. And per Football Outsiders this season, the New York Giants actually have one of the best offensive lines in the league at the moment. So it looks like the Zeitler trade might have helped in that way. This is kind of another situation where you think, for all the criticism that was had during the offseason for these coaching moves and the way that Minnesota is winning games now, if a coach can find something that differentiates them for the rest of the league, then they can kind of stick it to the people that are trying to tell them that what they're doing is wrong, even if it doesn't necessarily play out in the numbers all the time.
Well, I would argue that had they not, like, the Giants not made some of the moves that they have, that they would be a winning team and not 1-2, which we can talk about. Tampa Bay, good God. But yeah, I mean, let's just be realistic. They wouldn't have the offensive line if they didn't trade. Well, I guess they did get Vernon, or they traded Olivier Vernon, but that defense is atrocious now. So, like,
the defense is god awful. They have to score points, and they're not going to be able to do that, I think, without Saquon Barkley for 4-8.
Right, but I think the point is that they've made some questionable moves that, while, yes, Daniel Jones looked good in his first week starting, he may be a decent quarterback moving forward. They've had to sacrifice things like their defense to make these moves, to get Saquon Barkley, to get Daniel Jones, to get Zeitler. Like, it's still, they have their little wins, but overall they're still going to be a losing team this season and for the near future.
That's the thing that worries me a little bit, because last season, it was Saquon Barkley's rookie season. Even though the Giants were losing, I mean, he was completely healthy. He played all year. This season, he's going to be out 4-8 at a minimum, to me. If he's going to be out 4-8 at a minimum, what type of record would this team need to have for a guy like Saquon Barkley to come back at the end of the season? I mean, you wouldn't imagine that the Giants, who sacrificed as much as they did to get Saquon, would risk further injury this season if it's a lost season at that time.
Yeah, I agree. I can't imagine, like, they would have to be 500 to me to, or maybe within a game of 500 for me to say, okay, Saquon's going to be back. But that defense is just so bad. There's no way. There's no way, because regardless of how well, oh my God, I just forgot his name. Daniel Jones, Jesus, how well Daniel Jones plays here. And let's just say he's able to keep them in games. He's not Patrick Mahomes. Like, Patrick Mahomes can literally take a team and put them on his back and make them win a winning team. And we see that because Kansas City's defense is not good. Daniel Jones is not that person. The Giants do not have the skill players around Daniel Jones in order for that to happen.
That's definitely the case.
Right. And I have to imagine. Yeah. And I have to imagine, if they're not within, let's just say, one game of 500, or one game below 500, that they should just sit Saquon out the rest of the season.
And I think this is like the same type of thing that kind of transitions into AJ Green's situation right now. AJ Green came out and said that the reports of him missing 4 to 6 weeks were, they were blasphemous. They weren't anything that came from his camp. He thinks he's going to be out a lot longer. I think when you actually add money into this as well, that's definitely a consideration. AJ Green is one of the best receivers in the league. He's been one of the best receivers in the league every single time he's laced up on the field, but he's suffered a lot of injuries in the last few seasons. He's now going into a contract year. If he comes back for a losing Bengals team, gets hurt again, what does that do to him in free agency next season? It might be in his best interest to just kind of wait it out and come back healthy next season with a brand new contract, potentially on a brand new team.
If I were him, I wouldn't be doing it, because and this is more anecdotal than anything. I know what sprained ankles and feet, how long they take to heal. You're not right. You're not right for even a few weeks after they quote unquote heal. And AJ Green is 31 now. I think hopefully he understands that he is more injury prone as he gets older, and he can't heal as fast. And this is probably his last big contract. So yes, he should be holding out, and don't get Earl Thomas.
Speaking about holding out or not holding out, coming back, folding, Melvin Gordon to report Thursday. Austin Eckler has been absolutely killing it. He's been double digits every game, very, very involved in both the pass game and the run. Justin Jackson is seeing some touches, but Austin Eckler seems to have a role that's solidified to the point of, even if Melvin Gordon comes back, I would still think that there is RB2 value in a guy like Austin Eckler. Would you agree?
Well, he's had standalone value for the last 2 seasons. I can't. Well, I don't. See, here's the thing. I don't know how this is going to play out, because the Chargers could say, well, we're definitely not re-signing him, so we're going to just run him into the ground. But I still think Eckler, especially with, and I would have to look this up, but especially with Hunter Henry out, will still see a significant volume. It definitely won't be RB1 volume like he is right now, but he will still see a significant volume, and I would still say that he's an RB2 for the remaining games.
Do you have any concerns that maybe Melvin Gordon isn't as easily accepted as we would think? Maybe Austin Eckler retains that number 1 role for the next couple of weeks at least?
I would not be surprised to see that, no, because we know he's not playing this week. He's probably not in football shape because he hasn't been practicing or playing with the team. He hasn't played in game, so I would say it's probably a slow transition at this point. Like, Eckler will be an RB1 this next week, especially against the Dolphins. He'll probably get RB1 touches the following week, with Melvin Gordon mixed in and Justin Jackson basically being backup at that point. And then I think you probably after that, you start to see it switch.
All right. Case Keenum, 5 turnovers in one game. Yes, it was the Chicago Bears. A lot of people were pining for Haskins to be brought into that game. I'd like to remind everyone about a guy named Josh Rosen who started his NFL career against the Chicago Bears in a game he had no right to be playing in. So, I mean, if for nothing else, kudos to Washington for actually giving their guy a chance to succeed and not putting him out there against that defense in his first game playing mid-game. That said, after 5 turnovers, I mean, it's got to be Dwayne Haskins. I know the coach has come out and said that, you know, he's not necessarily going to be changing things and he doesn't think that Haskins is ready. But, I mean, at some point, just to get people in the stands, you have to put up a fight. And that doesn't seem to be a thing that really happened with the Washington football team this last game.
Yeah, I think I was in favor of, and I think I'm in general usually in favor of rookie QBs sitting and learning. I don't love that Daniel Jones is in there, though he looked great. But it's a losing season. I would say get him on the bench and learning for 8 weeks, and then let him play the second half of the season once you're officially out of it. The Redskins are 0-3 now. So it's going to be tough to convince me. I mean, the cries are going to grow larger and larger for Haskins. And it's not – so Case Keenum had an atrociously bad game last week, but it was the Bears. Before that, he was actually playing really well. Yes, he played the Philadelphia Eagles, but he also kind of torched the Dallas Cowboys, who are supposed to have a good defense. So it's not I would say this is not on Case Keenum. This is on that
the Chicago Bears defense.
Well, no, but this is just on the
also Case Keenum.
Well, I disagree with that because he did not lose them those first 2 games. He played well enough to win those first 2 games. This Washington defense is awful. Awful. Josh Norman is washed. That dude looks awful right now.
Yeah, he doesn't belong as cornerback 2 on any team. And
right.
I mean, him guarding number 1 receivers is just not a matchup that's been going in his favor.
So yes, like it would be one thing if it was Case Keenum playing awful. And like I said, Chicago, I mean, he did not look good in Chicago, but he's not playing awful. And I don't know where you go with that. Like, obviously, Dwayne Haskins is going to have to play, especially if the Redskins are just going to continue to lose. But when is that? Well, I don't know when their bye is either. Usually, bye weeks are what determine when rookies come in and start to get more snaps, get playing time. Week 10.
Yeah, just because there's more time to prepare.
Yeah, so week 10.
I don't think
week
it'll
10.
be up to week 10, though. I really don't, because, I mean, at some point, something has to happen or else he's going to get fired, and I think that's kind of where we're at this point. So,
I think he's getting fired anyway.
He's getting fired regardless, but, I mean, at some point, he's going to have to at least try to win a game. And if it doesn't necessarily turn around, I think after next week, then I think a plug is pulled, just because people will at least want to see what the future is in Washington, knowing that this is a lost season. But that is going to be it for our opening dialogue today. Now we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of the episode. We're going to get into the 5-point inspection. Our 5-point today is buys and sells. We already talked about the first guy a bit. We're going to bring him back up because it's just been something that, wow, it's not necessarily something we saw coming, not being able to start Stefon Diggs comfortably as a wide receiver 4. What are we to do with Stefon Diggs? I mean, for me, this is an obvious buy. Like I was saying before, it's going to be a pendulum in Minnesota. It's just going to go back and forth between Thielen and Diggs. They're both going to eat in that offense, not necessarily at the same time because of the volume issues that offense has. For as long as Dalvin Cook is healthy, in the event that Dalvin Cook goes down, I think the plan changes completely, and we start to see a lot more passing out of Minnesota, even with guys like Madison and Boone who are capable of backing him up. I just think that's what we saw last year, and I think this is kind of the same plan that Zimmer had all along. So for me, Stephon Diggs is still a definite buy. I mean, in Dynasty, it's not a question at this moment. In redraft leagues, if you're wondering whether this is a guy that you should be selling on name value at this point, again, I don't necessarily think that's going to be a good decision long term for you. Where do you stand on that?
I've already stated that I think that the passing offense for the Vikings is going to positively regress. Obviously, that helps Diggs. They are throwing the ball 9% less than the Seahawks did last season, and we thought it was astounding how few times the Seahawks threw the ball. There's no way they can maintain this. I think Stephon Diggs is a buy. There was a poll that I was tagged in earlier today, and now I have to look for it. But basically, it was: would you offer a 2020 first and second for Stephon Diggs right now?
Absolutely.
Right, and I believe it's Dynasty. I don't know why else you would. Okay, so it's 16-team PPR. Would you offer a first and second for Stephon Diggs? And I have to believe I would. Like, you're not going to get that kind of talent at wide receiver for cheap, especially in 16-team leagues. And this guy says he has 4 2020 firsts and 2 2020 seconds. So
Stephon Diggs hasn't even hit age 26 yet. And that's when wide receivers really start to get into their prime. I mean, this is a guy that you just have to be thinking long term. He's already attached to the team with the new contract that he signed. Him and Thielen are both attached to that team for the foreseeable future. So there's always going to be another threat for cornerbacks to not necessarily roll over on Diggs on every single play. It's going to kind of go back and forth between them. So again, this just is a situation where you stay the course. You understand the talent level that you have. You understand what this guy has produced before. You're just hoping for health out of Stephon Diggs at this point. You know the production is going to come eventually.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, I think he's probably the ultimate definition of buy low right now. The guy is one of the best, if not the best route runners in the game. They are going to have to use him. So, yes, you should be buying Stephon Diggs right now. Or holding. Do not sell him right now.
You cannot sell Stephon Diggs right now. You will get nothing close to what his actual value is. But we are going to move on. We're going to move on to another exciting player who's been wrought with poor usage, misuse. Snap share 15 in the NFL, 62.6% of snaps. Opportunity share of the running back group on the Detroit team, 62.8%, number 19 in the league. Number 8 in carries, but just number 39 in targets. We thought that Theo Riddick really meant that Kerryon Johnson was going to be used more in that passing game. It hasn't materialized yet. I think this is another buy low. I don't necessarily think this is something that we're going to see all season. I think he's been mismanaged the first couple of games because there's other guys in that backfield, and we're trying to get a guy that was formerly on the Patriots to do the Patriots thing and play all the backs in that offense. But eventually talent's going to win out. I think the same thing can be said for Aaron Jones. We can have that conversation later. But Kerryon Johnson, are you buying or are you selling?
I think he's probably the top of most people's buy lists. He saw a jump in snap share last week. He went from 57, 54 to 75% after they got rid of CJ Anderson. We'll see what they do with Paul Perkins. But yeah, I mean, and he saw what the most carries of his career in a single game with 20 last week, but he only had 36 yards on the ground. This offensive line has not looked good. It was something that we expected them to be able to do last year. They looked awesome last season. They are not good this season. They are ranked 26th in adjusted line yards according to Football Outsiders. So they have not been blocking well at all. And like you said, I mean, a lot of misuse, it seems like. So hopefully this week 3 performance signifies that they are just going to use Kerryon Johnson more. But like I said, they got Paul Perkins in there. Ty Johnson's still taking some snaps. So we'll see what they do. But yes, you should be buying him low because he has a 2.6 yard per carry average right now. So we know that he's going to positively regress for the remaining games.
Yeah, Kerryon Johnson, just like Stephon Diggs, is the obvious buy low. I think these questions can get a little bit tougher. And so I'm going to move on to the next one. Chris Carson. Here's the thing with Chris Carson. What you wanted from Chris Carson was you wanted the same thing that you wanted from Leonard Fournette. You wanted massive volume in that offense. And Chris Carson is giving you massive volume game in, game out. The problem is the quickest way to the bench for Chris Carson is fumbling the football. And that is something that he's not necessarily being able to overcome for the first 2 games of the season. Now, Rashad Penny hasn't figured as much. I think he's been banged up as well. But at the end of the day, if he continues to put the ball on the ground, it won't matter if he's necessarily the guy that Carroll wants. His hand will be forced at that point. That said, this guy is top 10 in targets. He's number 18. He's top 10 in carries. He's number 18 in targets. He only has 1 drop on the year. I mean, his true yards per carry isn't great at 3.5, but that Seattle offensive line isn't necessarily something that's great either.
30th in adjusted line yards.
He's been a guy that's getting it done in the face of stiff opposition. It's just something that he needs to correct. I hope he can, but he's a late round pick. I mean, if there's going to be an opening for Rashad Penny, I think this is it.
I agree. And if there's anybody that we can't trust in terms of coach speak, it's Pete Carroll. That dude lies through his teeth. But
he enjoys it. I think he does it on purpose.
Probably.
He knows people talk about it.
I would imagine that's probably true. But according to Pete Carroll, grain of salt time, Pete Carroll is saying that they still have confidence in Chris Carson. So I do think that Rashad Penny will probably get some more playing time. But Rashad Penny he has his flashes, but he is extremely inconsistent as well. He has not been good in his NFL career. So and we've seen Chris Carson dominate. We saw him dominate last season. I mean, he was, I think, 5th in rushing yards and finished as the RB14 despite only getting 24 targets. So if they're going to run the ball, I would not be so concerned about Chris Carson, because if they're going to run the ball 40 times, Rashad Penny, and I don't even know if that's a real number, but Rashad Penny can't carry the ball 40 times. He can carry the ball 25 times maybe, and then you get another 15 from Chris Carson. Chris Carson's going to continue to get volume. They don't have anybody else on that team. CJ Prosise, talk about injury prone and fragile. That dude had so much potential. He's been injured basically his entire career. So
for that one whole game.
Right. Right. Like he's got these flashes, like he's got this one run and power passing catch that he looks phenomenal, but then he breaks his shoulder blade. So I I think Chris Carson's a buy low right now because I think people are very concerned about those fumbles. But Chris Carson's the best running back on this team, and this team is going to run the ball a lot. So he's going to get some significant volume regardless of who's the quote unquote starter. So I would be buying Chris Carson right now.
We do mention that Seattle does run the ball significantly, but they've been kind of opening up the offense a little bit for Russell Wilson after paying him this offseason. You mentioned they were last in the league last season at only 47.56% pass to run ratio in favor of running, whereas this last season, or this most current season, we're seeing Seattle jump all the way up to 21st from rock bottom at 57.36% pass to run ratio. So that's almost 10% rise for them. We're seeing a lot of that volume distributed to both of those wide receivers. DK Metcalf has been better than expected early on, but Tyler Lockett is now doing what I thought he would always do: line up in the slot and see volume. And he's already a big play receiver, but the best receivers to me are the guys that can get you chunk plays and are peppered often. And that's what we're seeing from Tyler Lockett right now. In that first game, of course, you have to understand that
you know how to pivot into the guys you want to talk about. I'll give you that.
It has to be said if we're talking about the Seattle Seahawks. This is just something that, I mean, I think this podcast saw it coming, but we're just seeing a little bit more passing from Seattle is the point that I was trying to make. And I think for that reason, there may not be as much opportunity as we previously thought there was for a guy like Chris Carson if he starts splitting carries with Rashad Penny. Early on in the offseason, it was kind of like we thought that they both could be involved very heavily because of how this offense was going to run, and I don't necessarily see that as still the case.
I mean, we'll see. They're still running the ball at a 40-some% odd clip. Mm-hmm. They still rank
43%. It's 21st league wide.
Right. So we'll see. I think they've had to throw the ball at times too. They had to throw it last week, especially because they fell behind very early.
They're going to have to, because that defense isn't necessarily the same thing that it has been in the past. And if that defense continues to get torched, then they're going to have to come back in games. They're going to have to keep games close, and that's just going to be more passing for that team. The investment in Russell Wilson and in DK Metcalf this offseason indicated that they at least wanted to try to unlock what their MVP, really, QB could do if given the keys to the offense a little bit. But, I mean, they're still going to have that feel to them in Seattle. So, Chris Carson, buying, selling. For me, Chris Carson is a strong sell. I love him right now. I do think that a couple of games don't go quite right for him. I do think that he's one of those guys whose value could sink like a stone very, very quickly. I just don't necessarily want to be left holding the bag when that happens.
I'm letting you move on.
You haven't mentioned.
I already said I'm buying him. I did mention it.
You mentioned that you were buying him?
Yeah.
Okay. Devonta Freeman. He hasn't necessarily taken off, but he's been getting better. He was better last week than he has been in those previous two. This offensive line just isn't a very good unit. They tried to bring in a lot of talent along that offensive line to help protect Matt Ryan, to help open the running lanes for Devonta Freeman, but it hasn't necessarily happened again this season. This is a guy who still has some name value to him, who I still think has some volume to him. But if they're going to be down in games, as often as they've been down in games, then it's going to get to the point where he's not going to be utilized in that offense as much as we would like.
Well, I mean, I think we have to take into account the first 2 weeks, the matchups. He played the Minnesota Vikings in week 1. They are ranked 8th in DVOA against the run. They've allowed 11th fewest at this point fantasy points to running backs. That one is a little bit. I don't know what's real or not right now. They've shut down Freeman. They've shut down. Who did they play last week? They shut down the Josh Jacobs. Aaron Jones and Jamal Williams had a good game against them. So they're vulnerable, but when the Falcons fell behind so early, so fast in that game, that I think it not only was it a bad matchup, but it took Devontae Freeman out of that game. And then against Philadelphia ranks 4th in DVOA against the run. They have
that said, the Atlanta Falcons are still the 24th team overall when it comes to adjusted line yards. They're not just opening holes against these defenses, yes, that are good against the run, but I mean, you have to at least be able to play stiff competition every week, because that's essentially what you're going to get in that division. We just talked about the defenses improving.
That's fine, but then he gets a good matchup, and what does he do? He goes 16 for 88. So that's my thing here is he's been involved pretty consistently in the passing game. He's gotten 4 targets in every game. He gets a good matchup on the ground, and he excels. So, I mean, it's tough because
is Devonta Freeman a guy you're comfortable starting every week? I think is the point.
No, but
exactly, and I think that's kind of the point that we're trying to make here. Yes, he is a good player. Yes, he's going to have good weeks. At the end of the season, I would not be surprised if Devonta Freeman is a top 16 RB or so. That said, I don't necessarily think it's going to come steady enough for you to feel comfortable starting him in any given game.
And that's perfectly fine. But where you would need to buy him right now, or when you can buy him right now, he's not going to be, or he's not going to have to live up to that RB1 value.
What do you think you would need to give away to acquire Devonta Freeman right now?
Honestly, probably a 2022nd is what I'm looking at. Of course, running backs have weird value right now, but I would think that people have gotten sick of him through 3 weeks, that you can buy him relatively cheap.
Yeah, see, I don't know if anything lower than a first would be accepted because of the brand that Devonta Freeman kind of brings with him, and that's the danger for me. So for me, Devonta Freeman is just a solid hold if you have him. I wouldn't necessarily be trying to acquire him either. Aaron Jones, the touch split just keeps getting closer and closer between Aaron Jones and Jamal Williams. In the first week, I believe it was about 61% of the total RB touches went in favor of Aaron Jones. In the second week, it dropped to 57%, but that was actually on more plays. In the third week, we saw Aaron Jones struggle. While he still was able to give fantasy owners what they wanted with the 2 touchdowns on the ground, it wasn't necessarily a big day for him on the ground. And we see Jamal Williams being more and more and more involved in the offense. Do you think this is a situation that plays out last year, like it kind of did in Tennessee, where one guy has one half of the season and the other guy kind of starts to take off that way? Or do you really think that this is just a drive-by-drive type situation, and this is going to be how they're going to try and keep Aaron Jones healthy for later in the season?
I think it's probably going to be a drive-by-drive situation. I was unfortunately at the game last week. Not that
unfortunately. I don't know why.
Because Lambeau is an awesome stadium.
Yeah, but you spent money on a Broncos game this season. Like you knew you knew what you were getting yourself into.
That's fine. I didn't expect it to win. I didn't expect it to win.
Anyway,
See, I'm actually a good fan. I don't say I'm going to abandon my team for a division rival.
I'm never actually going to do that. It's just painful.
Okay, Aton.
It's painful seeing this happen to my team over and over again.
Over and over again as they won the 2015 Super Bowl.
If they don't have a veteran quarterback who actually has the ability to run that offense for them, the Denver Broncos are offensively inept, and
I am this is derailing. I could get really goddamn angry right now, but I'm not going to.
I tried.
So yeah, I mean, Jamal Williams looked actually really good last week. Aaron Jones is the most dynamic, the most talented running back on this team. But I don't think it's a Dion Lewis versus Derrick Henry situation. From what LaFleur has said, they want to even up the touches and the snaps. And Williams saw more snaps this week. He saw a lot more snaps this week. So I think it's going to continue this way as long as Jamal Williams is effective.
Jamal Williams came out of this game healthy. Aaron Jones was reported to have a shoulder injury. He was a full participant in practice today, but this is something that came out yesterday. Is this exactly why we're seeing the split? I really do think that this is just a scenario where you're having the coach understanding that he's having a player that can't be that full workhorse back. And so for that reason, to preserve him for when they need him at the end of the season, they're going to keep up with the split.
I honestly don't know because we have seen Jones get injured in both seasons of his career, I believe.
Finished both seasons on IR, yes.
But I think they're also going to be running the ball more. I mean, if we look at last season, I believe that the Packers were first in the NFL in terms of pass to run ratio. And I think this has a lot more to do with they're going to be running the ball more, and they just I think it's a mixture of both. They just don't know if Aaron Jones can take that type of load, and they're just going to be running the ball more overall.
Chicago Bears have an interesting situation that we spoke about a lot during this offseason. You have so many weapons on that offense. It's not a particularly good offense, and now you have to split between all the different guys that they offer, both at the running back position, at the wide receiver position, at the Cordell Patterson position. What does this mean for David Montgomery? Cordell Patterson with the goal line touch over Montgomery. What do we think is happening with the Chicago Bears and with David Montgomery this season? Is it kind of a situation where, like we were saying during the offseason, with the presence of Tariq Cohen, with how that offense functions, with the fact that that's a defensive team that's not necessarily going to put up loads of points on you game after game? Is this just a scenario where there's too many people battling for looks in that offense? Or do we think that over time, David Montgomery starts to solidify more and more of a role and becomes a more consistent player because of it?
Well, so we've seen Mike Davis's snaps go down to he had only one snap last week. David Montgomery's percentage has steadily increased through the first 3 games. But David Montgomery, and I'm sure people are going to be yelling at me for this, but David Montgomery is just not as good as a lot of people think. I saw a great thread by Nick Whalen last week talking about how David Montgomery needs to be more decisive, needs to hit the hole harder, needs to have better vision. And that was something that we talked about in the offseason is he dances and he doesn't have the best vision and he doesn't have good burst. Like he's a good pass catcher and he has great contact balance and can avoid tackles with the best of them. But this game is a lot faster than college. And if you're not going to be able to hit those holes, if you're dancing in the backfield because you don't hit those holes, if you're not getting what's given to you, then you're not going to succeed. And while David Montgomery did okay last week, he had a 5.15 yard per attempt average, he's still not getting all of the volume. And like you said, Cordell Patterson had 4 carries. Any other goal line carry. Tariq Cohen had 4 carries. So while David Montgomery got 13 carries to their 8, he's still sharing that backfield.
And I think one of the dangerous things that you can start to look into as well is, well, maybe you can blame some of the failures of Montgomery on his offensive line. Well, last season, Chicago Bears actually had the 28th overall offensive line by just in line yards per Football Outsiders, whereas this season they've actually improved and they're all the way up to 19th. This isn't necessarily a failure of the guys that they've got up front. I think this is just the offense because of the personnel that they have there. I really do think that this is a situation where they're going to win their fair amount of games because they have a really good defense and they have an offense that can be serviceable at times. But if it ever gets in a situation where Chicago has to win a shootout, I don't necessarily know if they can do it. And I think you always want running backs on great offenses. I don't think this is going to be a great offense week in, week out.
No, and I agree. And his ceiling is capped by Tariq Cohen. Like he's just not going to get the volume in the passing game he would need to be a guy that you rely on week in, week out. And if you look at all of his numbers, his true yard per carry is 32nd in the league. His big run rate is 30th. His big run's number 24. His juke rate's 19th, which is actually okay, but his production of premium is 47th. Like he's fine, but there were concerns. I mean, there was a lot of concerns for me, and I know of several other people about David Montgomery coming into the NFL. And those concerns are manifesting themselves. You muted yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. I didn't hear anything you said.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm not ready to declare David Montgomery a failed talent or anything of that regard. I just think that he finds himself in a situation where you have to do a lot to separate yourself at the NFL level. And Tariq Cohen is always going to be the better pass catcher on that team. That team has too many weapons for what that offense is going to be week to week. It's just going to be inconsistent because there's going to be a lot of different guys involved. It's not necessarily one of these situations where there's only 3 guys on the team that you really expect to have any offensive production in any given game. There's 5 or 6, 7 guys that can do it for you in Chicago. And I think that's more of a hindrance than anything else for any consistency out of a guy like David Montgomery. So for me, if you can find an owner that's going to give you something like a first and a second now for David Montgomery, I really do think that is a deal that I'm strongly considering.
Honestly, if I can get a random 2021st, I'm selling because this, I get it. We're looking into the future and who's going to be coming out, but because this prospective 2020 class is that deep, I feel that I can get a player with that 2021st that will be better than David Montgomery in the NFL.
Not only that, I feel I can get a player with that 2021st that's going to find himself in a better situation than David Montgomery found himself on a team that either wants to feature him more or has a more exciting offense that's going to be able to give him an opportunity to shine. So that is what I'd be doing with David Montgomery. The Saints, Alvin Kamara, Michael Thomas, both of them doing work even without Drew Brees. Is this something that we've just come to expect from Sean Payton offenses? Is this just something he's going to do every week, regardless of who his personnel is? Or do we really think that Kamara and Thomas are just those types of transcendent players that can stand up in the face of really, really stiff adversity when it comes to not being able to have a guy like Drew Brees on the field?
I mean, point me to somewhere else where that volume is going to go, because you can't trust Jared Cook right now. Jared Cook has slipped back into his pre-Raiders days where he's awful.
I don't know why people thought that Jared Cook was going to be a thing. It was never going to happen. There's just not the volume on that team. That's a rushing team. That's a running team, and has been for the last few seasons. That's the third banana on a running team. That's not a guy that you've ever wanted on your team.
So, and Traquan Smith is injured, but he came off of a rough season, though he looked like he was starting to maybe had taken a step forward, but now he's got Teddy. They're going to run the ball more with Teddy Bridgewater. That's just how it's going to go. So I had this discussion with Matt Williams, our friend Matt Williams, and he was talking about Alvin Kamara being a sell. And I just can't agree with that because
absolutely not. Absolutely not.
With Teddy Bridgewater, he's not a deep ball passer. And so that means there's a lot of dump down opportunities for Alvin Kamara, and he is one of the best pass catching backs in the league. So I don't know if you can expect them to have both. Well, no, they probably can both have 20+% target shares the rest of the season. And then with Alvin Kamara, I mean, he's going to get a ton of volume on the ground. Like he had one bad game against a tough defense with a guy with Teddy Bridgewater, who was just thrown in there, and all of a sudden we're concerned about him. I'm not concerned. The dude just produces.
And it's not only that, I'm willing to fall on the sword here. We talked about the Mark Ingram role being a thing in Saintstown, but that's not the case in New Orleans. Mark Ingram role left with Mark Ingram. Latavius Murray doesn't seem to be having that same sort of faith from Sean Payton. So that just means extra volume for Alvin Kamara. When Alvin Kamara had an opportunity to get extra volume last season, he was the number one RB in football. So I really do think that with everything that you were saying with Teddy Bridgewater, having an average depth of target that is going to be more in the Kamara range. Michael Thomas doesn't go all that deep too often either. I really do think that this is just a really concentrated offense amongst those two guys. And so this is something that you can predict week over week. These are the guys that are going to perform, and those are the types of situations that you really want to invest in. And that's why I think a guy like Michael Thomas is so very valued for anybody that has any concerns about even Drew Brees potentially retiring.
Yeah, so for the buy sell portion of this, I just, after last week, I can't imagine that people are going to be panicking. But with Teddy Bridgewater, if somebody's willing to give you a discount and say, and this is just a for instance, I don't know their actual value right now, but let's just say both of them are worth 2 firsts, or both of them are worth 3 firsts right now in terms of value. If somebody is offering to sell you them for 2 firsts, I think I'm buying them because I just believe the volume is going to be tremendous this season with Teddy Bridgewater.
And then on top of that, contract isn't necessarily something that you have to worry about with Alvin Kamara. I think you still have him for another season after this one. And it's going to be really interesting to see when guys like him and CMC come up for contract extensions. Yes, I know at least in CMC's case, he has the 5th-year option extension. Kamara doesn't have that. This is a situation where, yes, you don't necessarily want to pay running backs, but these guys are essentially their team's number one receivers as well. If that's the case, do we think we actually see the running back market start to turn just because these guys are so involved in the passing game? Or is this just a Le'Veon Bell situation where it doesn't matter how involved you are in the passing game? It's just not a position that teams are going to spend money on.
I'll say this. In terms of fantasy, according to Scott Barrett, a target, or is it a reception, is worth 2.8 times a running back carry. I have to believe that is true for the real NFL as well. You just don't get many guys like Kamara, like CMC, like David Johnson, like and Lev Bell's hasn't been overly efficient, but that can run routes, can create mismatches like those guys do. And they're able to run the ball. They're able to be the big back when they need to be as well. So those types, I absolutely see them paying for.
And I'm going to bring up something that you often mention when we talk about trying to look into the future of a team. Who are the teams that generally hand out big contracts to running backs? Those are teams that aren't necessarily paying the big bucks for a quarterback. Cam Newton has been injured. We don't necessarily know how that's going to go. We do think that he will come back and probably be Cam Newton, I think, for another 1 or 2 years. But at that point, then we really have to start to wonder what happens with that offense. Cam Newton, I believe, doesn't have long to run on his deal. And then when we talk about, other guys in tenuous situations, Drew Brees just got a major injury. It's very, very late in Drew Brees' career. I imagine all he wants to do is retire with a Super Bowl at this point after last season's debacle. But I can't imagine if he gets that opportunity this year that there's any more left in a guy like Drew Brees after suffering another major injury. All the rehab and all the work that he had to do to get back from the shoulder injury that actually put him on the Saints in the first place. These are going to be clubs that are in the market for a rookie quarterback, for a guy on a rookie contract, for a guy that's a little bit cheaper. And for that reason, they're going to be able to afford luxuries like CMC and like Alvin Kamara on these teams. So I think the stability factor is another reason why these guys are just supremely valuable right now in the Dynasty format. All right, so Jared Goff. Couple of down weeks, a decent week here or there. We're seeing the Rams continue to win games. It's not necessarily because of Goff. It's not necessarily because of Gurley. They're just kind of doing it. Do we think that Goff at this point is a guy that is a sell, that has more sell value than you would want to kind of hold? Or do you think that he's a guy that's just going to be in a good offense, going to continue to get better and better, has great wide receivers, has a great play caller that'll eventually get it clicking like he was last season?
I mean, I have to believe that he's still a top 10 dynasty QB. He's got 3 wide receivers around him that are the best. I mean, the best trio of wide receivers in the league, the best probably just wide receiver room in the league. He's got Todd. The one interesting part is Todd Gurley's not really been involved in the pass game. And I think that has taken a piece of that offense that kind of hinders them.
Todd Gurley hasn't really been involved in the games.
He's at 44. He's at 44 carries.
I understand. It's not the same impact because it's in less fewer scoring opportunities, fewer opportunities for big hits for Todd Gurley.
But it seems like they want to give him more opportunities, at least according to Sleeper, and I didn't read the source, but somebody from the Rams was saying they want to give him 25 touches a game, which, okay, we'll see. I think one thing that's going really not talked about right now, or mostly not talked about, and the heads up analysts are talking about this, is the change in that offensive line. They've lost 2 of their starters from last season, and they've generally been struggling. Their adjusted line yards, their adjusted line yards is fine, but their pass pro has not been fantastic this season. Actually, that's not even true. I'm just making stuff up as I go. Apparently.
I think a lot of that, I would just say I really don't necessarily think that the offensive line is struggling. I think Jared Goff's holding on to the ball a little long, and I think that's why you're seeing a lot of short passing from that team this season. If you actually look, this season marks a departure from what we saw, at least through 3 games last season, from Jared Goff. He was pushing the ball down the field a little bit more. He had an ADOT of 8.7 last year. It's just 7.9 this season. He regressed in completion percentage over expectation as well, 1.2% over expectation last season, about 2% under expectation this season. This is just a situation where I think that they're trying to figure out ways to win without putting all of the work on their main players in that offense. And as long as they can continue to eke out games, I think Sean McVay is just fine, not necessarily unleashing his full offense until the end of the year when the games start to count a little bit more. I think what we're seeing from the Rams right now is just a situation where they can win games based on just the team that they are and the set that they run and how different they are from the rest of the league and how they attack defenses. That said, I do think that this might be a Minnesota type situation. It's not going to be to that extreme when it comes to pass attempts or when it comes to leaning on the pass game, but I don't think we're going to see massive volume from Jared Goff this season. That doesn't mean that I'm off any of the receivers. I do think they'll all be just fine. They'll all shine in different games, but I don't necessarily, with you, think that Jared Goff is a sell for any reason right now. He's still in a great offense with players tied to him for the foreseeable future, with a head coach that has changed his career completely. And now, with the money and with the security to know that he's the long-term starter in Los Angeles. So I do think that he's probably a guy that you want to be trying to get a little bit low if you can right now. What are you paying for Jared Goff in a Superflex league?
I think he's at least worth 2 firsts. I mean, like I said, top 10 QB at this point. I don't think that three games indicate that he's taken a step back. A lot of people will point to, well, what about his second half? Fair enough. I still think that had a lot more to do with Goff or to do with Kupp's absence than anything. So yeah, I mean, I should say he is worth at least 2 2021sts. If somebody's panicking and you can buy for like a first and a second, I'd be doing that in a heartbeat.
Would you be buying Mark Ingram off of his 3-touchdown game against the Kansas City Chiefs? Not a great defense, but we saw him punch it at the goal line multiple times. And Justice Hill doesn't seem to be playing much of a role in this offense at all. In fact, we've been seeing Gus Edwards a little bit more than him. Is this a situation where you think Ingram can kind of keep this rolling throughout this season? Do you think maybe he's more of a long-term asset than originally thought? Do you think it's more of a one-year rental with Mark Ingram? Do you think that at this point, with his value at its highest point, this is a time that you should consider selling to try and accrue some future assets that can help you over the long run?
Because of age, it's very team dependent. If you have Mark Ingram and you are going to be a middle of the pack team, you can do some analysis after these first 3 weeks and be like, I don't know if I can push it here, especially with the guys I have. I would be selling him right now. If you are in competition and you don't have Mark Ingram, I would look at buying him because he's on a 2-year contract. We know this is a run first team. They rank 4th in terms of pass to run ratio. We know this is a run first team. They're going to continue to give him touches. He's up to 60% snap share right now. Like Eitan talked about, Gus Edwards is getting a significant snap share as well. But yeah, I mean, I think especially with Lamar Jackson and the threat he proves apparently through the air and on the ground right now, that Mark Ingram could be useful for the next 2 seasons. But again, if you need to rebuild, I would be selling him because he is an extremely valuable asset to you, and you can probably get at least 1 pick and maybe a young wide receiver that's not doing well right now. And I mean, I can't come up with any off the top of my head right now. But you can get assets from Mark Ingram.
I'd wait until about week 6 to sell him because I don't think this is necessarily going to be stopping anytime soon. Just like you said, this is the thing that they're going to keep rolling for a while because this is how that offense functions. And this is what Lamar Jackson does for a running back. It gives him free reign at essentially the middle of the field, whereas Lamar Jackson can threaten the edges for Mark Ingram. That works perfectly. That's actually kind of how Kamara and Mark Ingram were used, surprisingly. But I have to sell him. I 100% have to sell him because, like you were saying, I mean, age has to play a role at this point. We don't necessarily know what Baltimore is going to do next season at running back. We know that they haven't had a running back 2 years in a row for a while now. I don't necessarily think that they're crazily attached to anybody right now, so I'd be weary of having much of him later next season. That said, I really do think when you start to have those teams that are 4-2 heading into week 6 or 5-3, something in that range, and really think that they have a real opportunity to push it, Mark Ingram selling at that point, I think is going to net you even a higher return than you would get right now coming off that Kansas City Chiefs game. I do think that you're just going to have ample opportunity to sell him because unless an injury happens, this is going to be a thing that happens weekly with the Baltimore Ravens.
By the way, the Baltimore Ravens have of the remaining games, the third best schedule for running backs. Pittsburgh has number 1, so we didn't put him on here, but if you want to buy James Conner after his slow start, he might be a very good pickup as well.
Absolutely. He's another guy that's just going to get volume. I mean, for all the love that was thrown Jalen Samuels' way, he hasn't seen anything since James Conner hasn't necessarily been performing either. So that tells you a lot about kind of what that team knows about its running backs. It's still putting Conner out there, even though he's struggling because the team believes in him, at least for this season. Now, because he wasn't heavily invested in, I don't necessarily think that competition is outside of happening in Pittsburgh next season. But for right now, I do think that James Conner is going to be a very, very valued commodity come the end of the season in the playoffs and that type of time. Cam Newton, injuries over the last couple of seasons, it's a lot like the AJ Green situation. Great when he's been on the field, been off the field a lot, or been injured while playing, which is even worse. What do we think we're supposed to do with Cam Newton right now? I mean, he's a guy that, he's a top 5 QB. If he's playing, you just don't know if he's playing. You don't know if he's healthy. And if running was a huge part of the appeal of Cam Newton, if he's got to the point where it's dangerous for him to run, is there still tremendous value in Cam Newton?
That's my big concern right now. I mean, it sounds like he's dealing with a Linz-Frank injury, which obviously saps him of his ability to run the ball. And a Cam Newton that has to sit back and throw in the pocket is not nearly as effective as a Cam Newton that is a threat to take off and run. We know Cam's not the best passer in the league. In fact, he's probably one of the worst passers in the league in terms of traditional stats, in terms of his completion percentages, though he has shown flashes. But he is the weapon he is because of the fact that he could run the ball. And is this foot injury going to take that away from him? That's my concern. So this is going to be a little bit weird to say, but I would be selling him right now. Honestly, in most redraft leagues, he might be droppable this season just because I don't think he's going to be effective at all. In the future, like if you can get a 2021st and maybe a 2022nd for him in like a super flex league, I would be doing that because I just don't know how much he has left. And if he can't run the ball, he's just not as effective. In 1 QB leagues, I don't know how much it matters. I would be keeping him and picking somebody else up, pick up Kyle Allen, something like that. But yeah, I just in super flex, this matters more. I would be selling him if you can get at least a 2021st.
Cam Newton signed a 5-year contract worth $103 million just a season ago. In fact, last season.
Eitan, hold on. You were kind of breaking in and out there. So start again from the contract talk.
Cam Newton signed a 5-year, $8.8 million contract that runs through 2020. The cap on that contract is $23.2 million this year, $21 million next year. The dead cap drops from $9 million this year to just $2 million next season, and that is after being upwards of $30 million from 2018 and back. The guaranteed money is drying up on Cam Newton's deal, and if Ron Rivera ends up leaving that team, I think there's a strong possibility that we see the team try to go the cheaper route at quarterback so that they can pay guys like CMC in their rebuild as they try to become contenders in that space. Do you think that that's something that could be in Cam Newton's future? And if that's the case, is he a quarterback that you would still like on another team 2 years removed from an injury?
Nope. That's all I got for you. Nope. Why not? Like, seriously, like if he has to turn into a pocket passer, he's just not worth it anymore. And we see these running quarterbacks get their legs taken out from under them as they get older. So if he's just not going to be effective on the ground, then I don't want anything to do with him, because that to me says that he's not a QB1 anymore.
Yeah, I think that's where I'm at with Cam Newton as well. In fact, I traded for him in a Superflex league to replace Andrew Luck, who retired. So that's just going well for me. Really loving the quarterbacks that I spent on in that league. I ended up getting Josh Allen this past weekend just because I feel like I need something. Just like you, I don't know if Cam Newton is going to come back full speed this year, and I'm worried for his future when you look at the guarantees or the lack of guarantees remaining on that contract. So now we are actually going to finish our 5 point for the day. We're going to head into our Dynasty Diagnostic. But before we do that, our Dynasty Diagnostic is presented by MyBookie. So let's dive into the MyBookie pit stop. All right, guys. Bet, play, win with MyBookie. Make sure to do that. Let us know if you've given them a shout. Now we're going to plug in the analyzer, and we're going to get to this week's Dynasty Diagnostic. And our episode 47 roster was submitted by Fire and Geis. You can find him on Twitter at fire_and_Geis. Be sure to give him a follow. And if you want to be part of next week's show, go ahead and follow the podcast at Dino Diagnostic. Smash that subscribe button and leave us a review at the link in the description on iTunes and or Podbean. If you want to get to the front of the line and give our sponsors, MyBookie, a shout out, let us know, and we can get your team on the show.
As always, don't forget you can find shirts for the Dynasty Diagnostic and stickers at storenvy.com/stores. Search FF Pod Shirts. That is Dynasty Outhouse's store. He provides shirts for the Trade Addicts podcast, the Superflex Super Show, the Top Shelf podcast. I believe there are hoodies and mugs as well, and they do something with those wrist rubber bands, but 10% of the purchases go to Fantasy Care, so it's for a good cause. So go check that out. Again, storenvy.com/stores, search FF Pod Shirts. We also have a Patreon. We have started a Patreon, so come join us. It's in our pinned tweet on our podcast Twitter, or you can go to patreon.com/DYNO Diagnostic. Any donation is very much appreciated. As a patron, you get access to a private patron chat, a t-shirt, private diagnostics, and more. So yeah, go check that out. Eitan and I put a lot of hard work into this every week to give you as much information as possible. And so we would really appreciate your donation.
All right, guys, let's get into the roster. It is a 12-team, 1 quarterback, 1 point per reception. Start 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, 1 tight end, and 1 flex spot. At quarterback, looks like it's just a 1 quarterback league. So Russell Wilson and Phillip Rivers on the same team, even though Phillip has been topsy-turvy as he usually is. That seems to me like a lot of firepower at the quarterback position. I think that can be used elsewhere. That said, this particular team doesn't need that much anywhere else. So what would you be doing with this quarterback room?
I'd leave it alone. I mean, you have two reliable quarterbacks. Rivers is getting up there in age. I know you're not going to get much for him in the first place because it is one quarterback, but because of his age, you're probably not going. You're going to get even less. So leave it alone.
Yeah, this is definitely just a situation where you wait. I mean, you have Wilson and Rivers, you have upside, you also have a floor. I think that's a really, really good quarterback tandem. At running back, Joe Mixon, Chris Carson, Miles Sanders, Rashad Penny, Darius Geis, and Rodney Anderson. Mixon's a guy you still probably have some faith in. We don't necessarily know what's going on with Carson. We just talked about that before. Miles Sanders, like David Montgomery, finds himself in a situation where there's a lot of guys to battle for touches in that offense, and he hasn't necessarily been great on the touches that he's had so far this season. So I think it's going to take a little bit of time for the rookie to work himself in, although he is leading that team in carries. Rashad Penny can't necessarily seem to take advantage of the opportunities presented to him by Chris Carson. Darius Geis is injured. Rodney Anderson, I believe, is injured as well. I'm looking at one solid running back that I think will still be giving my team solid points in week 6. And that really, really concerns me. Where are you at with this group?
Before the Chris Carson fumble stuff, I would feel a lot better about this, but you're a little light. If that were the case, you would have two running backs that I still feel fine about Chris Carson. I still think he's the best running back there. I still think he's going to get touches. But after that, I mean, Sanders is in a timeshare. Even guys like 38-year-old Darren Sproles are getting significant snaps. Jordan Howard, has he disappeared at this point? No, he's still getting significant snaps. So, I mean, even last week, Sanders only had 34% of the snaps. Darren Sproles at 36. Jordan Howard at 33. It's a timeshare. Jordan Howard's contract is up after this season. Darren Sproles may be done after this season. So that's when things start to open up for Miles Sanders. So right now, he's not great for your team. But I'm holding out hope that he becomes the RB1 for Philadelphia next season. Now, like you said, Penny's, we'll see what, I mean, it's nice that you have that locked up. I don't necessarily like building that way, but it's nice that you have that Seattle Seahawks backfield locked up because regardless of who is getting the carries, at the very least, you have both of the major players there. So I'm fine.
Volume in one of those guys.
Yeah. Basically, you either Carson maintains his role or Penny starts to take over, and you have tremendous volume from either of those guys. So I'm fine with that. Geis, he's probably done. I would not be surprised to not see him again this season with the way that this team is going to end the season. So Geis is a tremendous running back, but he just hasn't been healthy. Maybe next year. So he's kind of a hold for me because you're selling low on him if you're going to sell right now. So he's a hold for me. Maybe he comes out and he just lights the world on fire next season, but you're going to have to wait another season. Rodney Anderson, I think, is droppable at this point. That dude, I believe, has tore his ACL a second time. So I'm not touching him. But you're weak. I mean, you're weak right now. Into the future could be a very strong running back group, but you're very weak right now, and you need to make a move if you want to compete this season.
You know, a guy who's probably not going to cost you a whole heck of a lot, who I would be going after on this team is Tevin Coleman. I do think when he comes back, he's going to be as involved as every other San Francisco running back, and he's going to provide value on whatever you have to get to acquire him right now. Understanding that he didn't necessarily have a huge game before he went down with the injury, and we've been seeing Matt Breida and Raheem Mostert kind of get all the accolades in that backfield as of now. This team is 3-0. Jimmy Garoppolo hasn't been great. He hasn't shown that he's going to be the death knell of that team. He hasn't necessarily shown that he's going to put up tremendous numbers either. that leaves a lot of room for a guy like Tevin Coleman, who I think you can acquire for something in the range of a second and a third at this point. And I think that would be tremendous value for a guy who's probably going to come back and give you solid RB2 weeks for as long as he's healthy this season. Would you agree with that, or is there another guy that you'd be looking for to add to this backfield?
I mean, you have two 2021st. If you can buy a guy like Kerryon Johnson, can buy a guy like James Conner, we mentioned a little bit, I would be doing that because I would feel a lot better about this running back room doing that. But even Mark Ingram, like, that's more of a win now move. But if you could get Mark Ingram for a first and something, add on something from your roster, let's just say, as I'm scrolling here, there you are. So if you had, what if you had a first and Corey Davis or a first and Dante Pettis to get Mark Ingram? That's a move I would be willing to make there.
Wide receivers: Odell Beckham Jr., Hollywood Brown, Robbie Anderson, Higgins, Pettis, Davis, Zay Jones, Devin Smith, and Hakeem Butler. OBJ hasn't had the start that a lot of analysts, myself included, thought he would have this season. I think that's very, very closely tied to Baker's struggles early on this season. Hollywood Brown has been much better than expected just because he's getting tremendous volume. Again, this is another situation where, at least in terms of the wide receivers, Hollywood Brown is dominating the touches in the Ravens offense. I do know that they use TEs a whole heck of a lot. I do know that primarily that's a running offense, but Hollywood Brown is a guy who can get a chunk play and is targeted heavily. I think those are the guys that you really want to heavily invest in. So I think he's a solid wide receiver 2 to 3 for you for the majority of this season. After Hollywood Brown, Robbie Anderson, it starts to fall off a cliff a little bit. So I see OBJ, Golladay, and Brown as legitimate threats on this team. For me, I need to add at least 2 wide receivers here to feel any sort of comfortable. If you're not adding 2 wide receivers, you would at least need to add 1 running back and 1 wide receiver. I think the point is 2 skill positions need to be added to this team for you to compete this season.
Yeah, I agree. I would use those 2 2021sts. Use 1 to get an RB, use 1 to get a wide receiver. Now, what kind of wide receiver? I don't know. I mean, Robert Woods is a buy low right now. I think if you use one of those first and got Robert Woods, I'd feel fine. Who else? I mean, Tyler Lockett at this point is probably worth more than the first. Same with Boyd. But if you get that kind of realm. Tyrell Williams, that's another one where he's getting a ton of volume and he's a wide receiver 1 in that offense. And if you had OBJ, Golladay, Hollywood Brown, Tyrell Williams, Robbie Anderson, I would feel very good about this wide receiver room.
I'd be looking at a guy like Larry Fitzgerald. Larry Fitzgerald plus another asset that you can use to kind of further bolster your team. That way, maybe you don't necessarily need to trade both firsts. If you can get a smaller piece back, maybe like a D.D. Westbrook and someone like Larry Fitzgerald for a first and a third, something in that range is probably something that I'm exploring at this point because that gives you points for this season that also gives you the potential for a future, and that solves kind of two birds with one stone, so to speak. So that's the type of deal that I'd be looking to make here to just give you the numbers to stay competitive this season when your team inevitably hits attrition and guys start to fall from underperformance or just from injury throughout the year. Evan Ingram, as I was saying all offseason, is this year's George Kittle. And why is Evan Ingram this year's George Kittle? It's because he's in the same situation as George Kittle found himself in last season. Now, I'm saying this before Golden Tate is added into this offense, so make of that what you will. But it's my belief that Evan Ingram is the number 1 wide receiver on this Giants team. You just talked about the Giants defense not necessarily being able to stop anybody. If that's the case, they're going to have to chuck it a whole heck of a lot. And a guy that's going to be heavily targeted in that offense is Evan Ingram. we're already seeing an increase in snap share from Evan Ingram this season. If you give me a second here, I can actually look up what his snap percentage was compared to last season. I do know it is on the rise. All right, so Evan Ingram this season has an 84.3% snap share, 25% in the slot, which is ranks amongst the top tight ends in the league. When you compare this to last season, it's just 68.7% snap share, number 20 overall in the league. Also, he suffered injuries at that point. That's huge. That's a huge difference. And all you want from the tight end position is massive volume. All you want is targets. Evan Ingram has 30 targets in 3 games. Number 1 in the NFL at the tight end position. The volume is there for him this season because he is that team's number 1 wide receiver with OBJ no longer a part of this offense. With Saquon Barkley gone, I think that even adds to his usage for the remainder of the season. And I mean, if there's one guy to have that is a giant on your team, I think it's got to be Evan Ingram. I really do think that he's the guy that is really going to challenge for one of the top 2 tight end spots this year.
Yeah, you're not hurting here at all. I mean, Evan Ingram, I would say top. Yeah, I mean, I would say he's at the very least top 5, but I think the volume's going to be there. He's getting probably better targets with Daniel Jones. So I'm not really concerned about Golden Tate coming back because, like you said, they're going to have to throw a ton without Saquon. So having him as your tight end 1, you're pretty much set. That's a set and forget position right now. And then Chris Herndon
stays healthy,
right? And Chris Herndon coming back from the from suspension after, I believe, the bye week, which is this week. So he should be there in week 5. And Sam Darnold also comes back that week as well. Sam Darnold obviously looked to Herndon a ton, especially in the red zone last season. We'll see how he's integrated into that offense now with Jamison Crowder out there as well in kind of the same space with Le'Veon Bell coming out of the backfield catching balls. But I don't mind Chris Herndon as my backup tight end right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really capable backup on this team. I think you're solid right there. You have 2 2021st. We already talked about what you think you should do with those. You got 2 spots to fill. However way you want to do it, it's 2 spots that you have to fill on this team. It's not just one guy. So I wouldn't spend it all on that one big name player. That said, I do think the team is relatively competitive. I do think right now you're probably at the edge of playoff contention, which might not necessarily be what you want to hear, but I think if you make those additions to this team, you do have the potential to be a real force in the playoffs. It's just a matter of what you're willing to sacrifice in terms of the future. But this is a pretty solid team here. I mean, if I had to compare it to an automobile, I'd say that this runs great. I mean, it's not super flashy. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but I mean, it gets the job done. It's a Honda Accord. It's gonna run. It's gonna run well. It's gonna get you to where you need to go, and there's nothing to really necessarily worry about it. It's gonna be reliable time after time as long as you keep it maintained. What about you, Sam?
Ford Escape, kind of the middle class version, or just of a cheap 4-wheel drive pickup or car or whatever. Like, it's just like you said, not flashy. It will get the job done in all weather. You could definitely make some upgrades here. But yeah, I mean, I feel okay if you stay healthy throughout the season, but attrition happens and you do need to, if you want to compete, you need to trade those 2021sts for, I think, a running back and a wide receiver.
All right, guys, that is going to be it for us today. Thank you for joining us, fellow technicians. Thank you for coming into the shop. Also, please go to the Dynasty Diagnostic podcast feed on iTunes. Give us a 5-star rating and review. It really helps the podcast grow and reach more listeners. Thanks for making it to the Dynasty Diagnostic Service Center today. Please be sure to keep up with their scheduled maintenance and catch us next time to ensure quality performance. See you on your next visit.